And the answer was, there is no other business except for this particular piece of legislation dealing with electoral reform. But we all know this week we did see other issues raised in this House, issues that weren't, issues brought up by us, but certainly other issues that weren't so great to be dealing with here in this House for the time that we've been here. I guess, you know, I was really disappointed to also hear that the public consultation that I understood would be happening in between the fall session and when we would next be called back into session would be taking place. That really hasn't happened. There has been no consultation on Bill 117 with the public. There hasn't been enough time to give the public notice of full consultation on this bill. There was no full consultation with my leader and my colleagues of the official opposition, and that's a shame. That's a real shame. Here in this House, we have spent countless hours discussing and debating this Bill 117. We have heard nothing from the government side, and certainly nothing from the Liberal side of the House. And that's not a true democratic process here happening. What we have seen are colleagues standing one by one speaking on this bill. We have seen a disinterest from the government. We have seen a disinterest from the Liberal caucus. And that's not true democratic discussion here in this House. It's not a sharing of ideas. It's not the way Nova Scotians perceive government business to be handled, without real debate and the sharing of ideas. There is no accountability here and no responsibility here shown by this government and the Liberal caucus in tow. The leader of the official opposition and my colleagues have brought forward and demonstrated our want to have true electoral reform. We've offered several ways in which electoral reform can happen in this province. To be here and witness the votes and members standing on their feet and voting and feeling that there was absolutely no interest in what the voting was for. There were not, I don't think, there was one member on the government side or the Liberal caucus side that actually heard what was being discussed on this side of the House, because there was no interest. So here we find ourselves in a place where we have not moved forward at all with electoral reform. This bill is one of inequality and which continues a sense of entitlement for some, a very false sense of entitlement. It also continues the very misbelief of some who may feel it is their rightful place to be here. And that is a very, very misconception. And Nova Scotians do not elect us because we feel it is our rightful place to be here. They elect us to represent their voices, their concerns, not our concerns, not our voices. They don't elect us to represent our party voices. They don't elect us to see us try and move forward legislation that is in our party's best interest. We are elected to represent their best interests, and so it is not our rightful place to be here. It is a humbling place to be here. Many of us have worked very hard to be here. And that's not to say that every member in this House has not worked hard to be here. This bill continues the long, tired tradition of party financing that includes corporate donations, union donations, and the use of Liberal trust funds that are very suspect. I am really surprised that the Liberal caucus here didn't take the opportunity to speak on this bill, especially in light of the fact that there is a Liberal leadership race happening in just a couple of months, a few short months, and not one Liberal member chose to get up on their feet and discuss why they wanted to see this bill move forward. Not one chose to stand on their feet and defend the use of suspect Liberal trust funds. Not one. I am hoping that at that Liberal leadership race, that many of the Liberal Party members ask those sorts of questions of the leadership contenders. I would be very curious to hear some of those responses, because they certainly chose not to represent their thoughts here in this House. Not one government member stood on their feet to discuss what they felt were the benefits of this particular legislation. Not one. What signal does that send the people of Nova Scotia when government members who are putting a piece of legislation forward with little or no discussion choose not to stand and speak? What does that tell Nova Scotians? It tells Nova Scotians that government is not interested in really debating, in really discussing true electoral reform. This continues to be old party politics, and Nova Scotians are not going to buy into this anymore. The people of Nova Scotia are losing faith in government. They're losing faith in politicians in general. The voter turnout in Nova Scotia continues to decrease every year on the municipal level, on the provincial level, and on the federal level. That's the sad reality of how Nova Scotians feel about our political system. For us to be here discussing electoral reform, Nova Scotians need to be included. They need to be informed. They need to trust that government and the politicians that they represent, that they elect to represent them, are truly going to discuss and debate the issues, and not avoid debating those issues. We as politicians and political voices, we need to demonstrate that we are able to build better relationships with the voting public. Nova Scotians have no appetite for politics that continue to promote the financing of political parties through corporate and union donations and suspect Liberal trust funds. The leader of the opposition, the official opposition, and my colleagues, we came up with real ideas, real opinions. We stood on our feet day after day, hour after hour in the fall session and here during this session. And the government and the Liberal caucus chose not to participate in those ideas and in that discussion. We stood here and we said, ban all union donations, all corporate donations. There wasn't even discussion around that. We indicated all of the reasons why we should see the banning of corporate donations and the banning of union donations. One of my colleagues pointed out, and rightly so, that this will be the last time, the very last time, that any other member of any other political party other than the official opposition that stands here today will ever be able to challenge us or to use that old tired line, the NDP are in the pockets of unions. And we will campaign in the next election, and we will make sure that Nova Scotians understood and understand where we stand on electoral reform. We will make sure they are reminded of this week's session where no true debate has taken place. no true discussion. And in some ways, some Nova Scotians will look at this session as a waste of time, a waste of Nova Scotians' time. And they'll look at this as a waste of time because we have not dealt with many issues that really concern Nova Scotians, that really, truly interest Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians have real concerns and issues and expect, and rightly so they expect, but the people that are elected in this room, they expect us to bring those issues forward on a daily basis. Instead, the government chose to see us here for a week to discuss the interests of one bill and on party financing. Many families across this province and in our communities struggle every day just to survive, struggling to make ends meet, to put food on the table, to pay the rent, and to pay for heat. Many of those people are living in poverty daily. They don't want to hear us talking about party financing. They don't want to hear how this bill will continue to promote corporate donations and union donations and the use of liberal trust funds. They are interested in knowing how they will continue to make ends meet day after day. Can they afford to go into the grocery store and purchase milk or purchase the nutritious food that they need for their daily diets? Many Nova Scotians work tirelessly around the clock in this province at minimum wage jobs, and they still live in poverty. They're not interested in hearing us spend hour after hour talking about electoral reform. That's not even true electoral reform. We have many communities struggling in this province. Aging populations. Communities are seeing a growing number of seniors in their communities. Seniors who are looking for access to health care, seniors who need long-term care facilities. Those are real issues in our communities. We have a serious problem with out-migration of youth in our communities. That's what our people are concerned about. That's what Nova Scotians are concerned about. For them to look at what's happening here in this House this week, where government and the Liberal caucus choose to just discuss about their own party interests, is not in the best interests of Nova Scotians. Small business owners across this province are challenged year in and year out to balance their books, and yearly they have to continue to look at ways to revise their business plans, just in the hopes that they can survive the next year. They're not interested in government filling their own pockets, thinking about their own interests. They're interested in surviving. They want government and politicians to be speaking out in their best interests. We have seen in the last week pork producers from across this province come to this House, and they wanted to discuss real ideas. They wanted to discuss their real issues. They struggle yearly. They're in a crisis situation, and this government couldn't come up with a plan, couldn't come up with real incentives, couldn't come up with real solutions, couldn't even come up with a yes answer that they would sit down at the table on a continuous basis to help these pork producers. We were too busy in here. Government was too busy trying to push this piece of legislation forward, dealing with party financing. And of course, there were other issues that kind of stood in the way of real issues. Our agricultural communities across this province, they have real issues, real struggles that are really important to the survival of Nova Scotia, to the survival of our rural communities. Instead, here we are at the government's will to discuss Bill 117 on electoral reform. Thank you. Yeah. Our fishing communities across this province are in dire straits, struggling. Our fishing communities are not as vibrant as they once are. We have a lot of serious issues to deal with in our fishing communities, and we need to seriously consult with our fishermen across this province to understand their needs and work with them to help them sustain one of our natural resources. But instead, this government chose to bring us back here for a week to try and push through a piece of legislation that deals with party financing, filling the pockets of politicians, feeling that it's an entitlement to continue old-style politics, corporate donations, union donations, and tainted suspect Liberal trust funds. The time we have spent in this House this week has proved very little to the province of Nova Scotia. It has been an embarrassing week at the best, and probably for most Nova Scotians, an interesting week, because I suspect that they're walking away shaking their heads and saying, we've elected these members of the House, and they have chose to do nothing to really represent our concerns. I suspect when I go home in my riding, and I already have a volume of emails, a volume of calls, but I suspect I'm going to have a lot of people coming into my office and asking me just what the heck is going on. What is government doing? But they will know that the official opposition, my leader and my colleagues, have been working very hard in this House, very hard to represent the views of Nova Scotians. Even though we have been brought back here to deal with party financing and a piece of legislation that is not true electoral reform, we have been able to talk about the real issues that Nova Scotians want to be hearing. The questions that we were able to ask in this House dealing with consumers of mental health services, seniors, education questions, questions around the need for our pork producers and our agricultural communities to survive and their issues. Those are the issues that we attempted to bring forward. Those were the issues. We have worked diligently in this session. We have chose to use the opportunity that the government gave us, calling us back for this week to deal with a piece of legislation, to get those issues forward, to get them, try to get them front and center. Unfortunately, there were a lot of other things happening in this House that we had to work very hard to try and get those issues in the public eye, to prove to Nova Scotians that we continue to work on their behalf, that we continue to work in their best interests, that we do stand up and support all of our families across this province and the struggles that they are enduring day after day. And we will continue to do that when we leave this House. And I am looking forward to getting back into my riding with the people that have elected me and those who are looking at me as, you know, it's a good thing she is there. Those who perhaps didn't vote in my direction but are looking at me and saying, you know what? She does work hard and she does know our issues. And she will continue to work hard, and we have faith that she will continue to represent our views. That's what I'm looking forward to doing. I can't wait to leave this House this week and to get back where I belong in my community, serving the people that have elected me to be a voice here for them. And I will be telling my constituents about this week in-house. And I will be telling them that for the most part, while this government exists, that old party-style politics will continue to happen in Nova Scotia, that true electoral reform did not happen in Nova Scotia in this session. But it will happen, and I truly believe that the day will come that true electoral reform will happen in this province. We stood here and we gave options. We came up with alternatives. And the government still refused to even discuss those options, to even debate those options. Not one member stood on their feet here. That's really surprising. All of the members here were elected to represent their views. Were there no constituents in your ridings that kind of had given you any indication of what you should be voicing here around electoral reform? Maybe the constituents were just not interested because it dealt with party financing, covering our own butts with money that, corporate donations, taxpayers' money. This is not electoral reform. This was an opportunity. This bill could have provided a real opportunity for true electoral reform. We should have been talking about real grassroots building, really connecting with the voting public, really demonstrating that there is a need for electoral reform and grassroots connecting here in the province. Nova Scotians, they're a smart group of people. We have some of the most vibrant people across this province. And sometimes we take for granted that perhaps they're not listening, they're not watching. But you know what? They are watching and they are listening. And they know who is standing on their feet and who are not. They know who is sincere in bringing good ideas forward, that has the ability to bring good ideas forward. They have been watching each of my colleagues here stand and bring good discussion forward to this House. And they also know that that good discussion went unheard. Many of us know what it takes to run a campaign in this province. Those of us that have run in elections before and ran in the last election, we've all worked really hard to build the grassroots around our associations. Most of us have been involved in fundraising and other initiatives to become visible out there in the public eye. And it's a lot of hard work. It's hard work to put a fundraiser together, whether you're selling tickets or whether you're putting on a fundraising dinner, whether you're selling tickets on turkeys or whether you're selling 50-50 tickets, whether you're doing 3 fundraising dinners a year, whether you choose to do auctions, whether you choose to buddy up with another fundraising event. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to recruit volunteers. Volunteers who believe in the party but perhaps don't have the time or sometimes the resources. And it's a lot of work to recruit volunteers who perhaps will have the time and will have the resources to help with building a financial base so that parties and candidates can run campaigns. But it's not a lot of work when corporate donations are handed over to political parties. It's not a lot of work when union donations come into play. And it certainly isn't a lot of work to dip into trust funds that perhaps are suspect. There's no work to that. There's nothing really involved with doing that. There's really not a recruiting of volunteers. Perhaps there may be a little bit of networking on the side. And perhaps, too, on the other end, there may be, just maybe, a donation comes in and there's an expected return. An expected return. It may not be said out loud. It may not even be clearly evident of what the payback should be. It may not even be suggested, but there's something that's still not right. There's something that's, you know, a donation comes in and it's a fairly substantial donation, and, you know, there's a popular belief out there that those types of donations come with ties, come with political ties. And to the average Nova Scotian, the average voter, to have that perception only gives more cause why they continue to lose faith in the political system. They don't generally believe politicians when politicians say there are no ties, no strings attached. There's nothing that I have to give back for this particular political donation. Do you think we're believed if we say that? No, probably not at all. But to have volunteers out on the ground networking and raising funds with no expectation of any return, no, there's not even a perception that there will be something given in return when funds are raised that way. This was an opportunity to really build the grassroots, to talk with individuals, to give individuals the opportunity to decide whether or not they will contribute or should contribute or may think about contributing to political campaigns. But we lost that opportunity. And that's a shame. We've spent hours and hours in this house, and we lost that opportunity. We have so many issues that we're not dealing with, that we didn't deal with here in House. And it will be interesting to hear the public feedback that comes back to each and every one of us when we go back into our constituencies. And I would be very interested in hearing what each of you may be telling your constituents. When you're asked about electoral reform, when you're asked about the other issues that were dealt with in this House, when you're asked about the embarrassing moments that took place in this House, and when you're also asked, so what work actually got done? You were all here for a week and X number of hours, and so what work was actually accomplished? Can you tell me if you earned the salary that you make out of taxpayers' money? Did you really earn that this week? I would be interested in hearing some of the answers, because I know on this side of the House and the official leader of the opposition and my colleagues, I know I earned every hour that I worked here. I stood here on my feet. I sat here day after day with my colleagues, side by side, and we represented the views of our constituents. When I had a break, what was I doing? I was phoning into my constituency. I was returning calls. I was sending emails. I was in touch 2 and 3 times a day with my constituency. That was the work that I got done in this House. And then I stood on my feet and I asked questions relevant to my constituents.
You're here. That's why you're here. That's why you're here.
And I also stood in support of my colleagues and the leader of the official opposition in opposition to
Order,
this
please.
Bill
Order,
117.
please. Maybe I could ask the honourable member to return to the third reading of the bill that's before the House, please.
Said 117.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill 117 is exactly why we're here. This is why we were called back to House. We were called back to deal with one piece of legislation, electoral reform, And we have seen no real reform here in this House. What we have seen is the same old, same old. There was no real public consultation. There was no real discussion out there. There was no real discussion with the official opposition. This is a minority government, and we need to work together. And this week has been a demonstration of a very fractured minority government, because the government and the Liberal caucus, the coalition that has been formed, has not been an effective working minority government. This government chose to shut out the official opposition on consultation on Bill 117 and chose to ignore members of the official opposition when they stood on their feet time after time, day in and day out, hour after hour. They've been walking back and forth, they've been talking amongst themselves, they've been reading papers, doing work, instead of listening to debate and participating. Not one member, I can't remember all this week, one other member in this House, on the other side of the House, standing on their feet and saying one word about this piece of legislation. That's astounding. That's not the democratic process. There was no consultation, there was no discussion, no serious discussion at all. We came forward with real ideas around electoral reform. End corporate donations, end union donations. Get rid of the trust funds. So that wasn't appealing, that wasn't discussed, that wasn't taken seriously, so we came back with other amendments. We came back with other ideas around electoral reform. We put different timelines, extended timelines. But that wasn't of interest to the government. That wasn't of interest to the Liberal caucus. They weren't interested, it seems, in changing anything. They came forward with their own views. Here it is, here's the paper, end of discussion. End of discussion. This is a minority government. This is not democratic at all. There was no debating, there was no real discussion. That's not what we were elected to do. We were elected to represent our constituents, and we were elected here to share ideas. This bill is clearly...
Order, please. The Honourable, the Minister of Agriculture.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is carping away about the way the legislature works, and different pieces of legislation were brought forward. Many amendments. Some of them lived, some of them didn't. Some amendments were even supported by some members of the honourable member opposite's party. And the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, and you would know well, and you would know. Well, I don't know if he got suspended yesterday. He said he was supposed to support it, but anyway. But the point I was making, back to the point of order, Mr. Speaker, the members should know, and I know she's a new member, but the point is that, you know what? That's the way democracy works. If you don't like it, you're going to have to suck it up, because that's the way democracy works in the legislature.
Before I recognize the honourable member, the honourable minister knows that it's not, that point of order is not in order, and I will now recognize the honourable member from Queens to continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To get back to Bill 117, you know, when we left here in the fall session, a lot of us were with the understanding that there would be real consultation around this bill. I remember sitting here and understanding that there would be a committee formed, and that committee would consult with Nova Scotians across this province about what they expected to see in electoral reform. Did that happen? No, it didn't happen. When is it going to happen? After the bill is passed, so that perhaps we need to come back and do this same sort of exercise over again? You know, public consultation is just something that this government doesn't seem to understand. There have been so many issues besides this particular piece of legislation that the public has been asking to have a say on, to be part of the process, and they are constantly shut out. And that's what happened with this piece of legislation. When this session was called back, the public was completely shut out of these discussions. And that's not what we were elected here to do. We are elected on the public's behalf. We were elected to represent their concerns, not our concerns. This isn't about, being in this House isn't about the money we raise for our political parties. This has no place in this House. It shouldn't have a place in this House. There are volunteers and members of our parties that give of their time to help volunteer to raise funds. We shouldn't be taking up hours of House time and business to be talking about filling filling our pockets. Party financing is a discussion that required in this House more outside discussion between the parties so that we could come in here and come up with true electoral reform. The next election will be an interesting walk forward. I will be telling constituents that we stood here in this House talking about true reform, that we're not interested in union donations, that has always been a misconception. That has always been, we offered that we wanted to see a banning of all corporate and union donations. We took that stand, and we stand behind that. And I stand behind my leader, the leader of the official opposition, and my colleagues with that move. That was a bold move for our leader to stand here and say, we want a banning of all union donations. And along with that, a banning of all corporate donations. You will never again be able to walk up to anyone in this province and say, you know what? The NDP are in the back pockets of unions. How many years have we listened to that? That's kind of like the same old tired statements we hear about the tax and spend of the NDP. What is with that? That is so old and tired, and it's not true. I mean, have you looked around at some of the successful NDP governments in the country? We have Manitoba and Saskatchewan, you know? But it's old, tired, old-style politics, the fear-mongering that is old-style party politics, you know? And electoral reform, you know.
Buchanan didn't do nothing to Nova Scotia. Watch what you say.
You don't even participate. You just sit there. You just sit there, union brother.
Old party politics.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member from Queens has the floor, and it's very difficult from the chair to hear the honourable member. Please, I would ask honourable members if they want to pursue their discussion to take it out of the chamber. The honourable member from Queens has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I'm sure there are many who are sitting here today that are saying, you know, this is all repetitious. We've heard the same thing over and over and over again. But you know what? I may be standing here saying the same thing in this particular speech. Maybe I've repeated myself a bit. But you know what? I do that with my children. That is something that I learned very early on with my children. In order for them to truly understand what I was saying, I would have to repeat myself time and time again. And we have been standing here trying to get the government and the Liberals to really understand true electoral reform. And it seems to be falling on deaf ears. And as I've said earlier, not one member has chosen to stand on their feet, except on the odd point of order, which comes more out of seemingly frustration and perhaps a valid point of order, but we have heard really nothing. It's truly interesting. And as a new member, it's truly eye-opening, I must say. This has been one of the most interesting experiences since my 6 months here in office. Truly interesting. And I'm looking forward to helping my constituents understand the past week here. That will be an interesting process when I'm going back into the riding of Queens, which I'm very much looking forward to. The work that I've been doing in my riding, I'm very pleased with the results. I have people coming into the office and thanking me for just listening, for being part of for them to be part of the process. They share with me their concerns and their issues, and I've been moving them forward. And that's what I intend to do when I get back into my constituency. And I hope that they share their thoughts around electoral reform. I will sit with any constituent that comes my way and wants a full understanding, and if information that I may not have in front of me, I will certainly make sure that I get all of the accurate information for them, and I will share with them just what happened here, and I will be asking for their input. I will be asking what they think about electoral reform. Do they think that it's right for this piece of legislation that allows corporate donations to carry on, that allows union donations to carry on, and that allows the Liberals to continue to use that trust fund money that has been surrounded by scandal, surrounded by suspect. We had an opportunity here and we missed it, but that's not surprising either, because I kind of sensed that we were going to miss an opportunity from the fall session. I mean, we seen the same kind of disinterest from government to truly discuss the issue. We've seen a disinterest from the Liberals, and we knew that this coalition was kind of there, and that this was not something that was going to be really discussed here. And I guess perhaps most of us sensed that back in the fall. But when we walked away with the understanding that there would be some consultation happening, that was, I walked away thinking, well, you know what? Perhaps the government will really follow through in putting a committee together and seeing that committee go across this province and talk to Nova Scotians about what they see as electoral reform. What do they think we should be doing in terms of party financing? But those questions weren't even addressed because there was no committee. What happened to the idea that there was some sort of an agreement that a committee would actually be formed, that the public would actually be part of the process, that they would be consulted? Well, it turns out that it was a bit of a joke, perhaps a bit of a joke on this whole House, because it never happened and it's not going to happen, and maybe it'll happen after this legislation goes forward. But what will that prove? Will it prove that we have to find ourselves back here discussing again electoral reform after a committee goes around this province and talks to Nova Scotians and they come back with recommendations, and all of a sudden the recommendations are different than what we have in Bill 117, which actually is not electoral reform at all? I suspect what we may hear from the public, should a committee go around this province, is we're going to hear, what about the real issues? What about the struggling Nova Scotians across this province? What are you going to be doing about the fact that we are losing our youth out west and to other provinces looking for jobs, because our economy, even though the numbers may show otherwise, we don't have a robust economy here in Nova Scotia. And it's false for us to think so. It's false for us to put stock in numbers that may tell us, well, the unemployment rate is down, but really, the economy is not robust. We have an out-migration of our youth, we have an aging population, we have a broken healthcare system, we have a system that does not service consumers of mental health issues. Those are the issues that I suspect we're going to hear throughout a public consultation process on electoral reform. I think some of those Nova Scotians are going to say, well, hey, wait a minute, that's all fine and good. I'll give you my ideas around electoral reform, but I also want to tell you that you should be addressing these issues, and I don't see the government moving forward on any of these. What is the government's plan? What plan do we have? And where is, what else is interesting is when we talk about this committee and this public consultation, members did not get up on their feet from the government side and explain what this committee is going to look like. That was an idea that came and went in the fall session. It was put out there, it was chatted about quickly in the fall session, and now we're faced with a piece of legislation, and I don't see any reference to a committee. I don't see any involvement of the public at all around this piece of legislation, and that's really surprising because it was there. That suggestion was there in the fall. I was here. I walked away thinking that that consultation across the province was going to happen, that we would not be discussing Bill 117 until some months into the future after the public consultation happened. But again, as in previous issues, when public consultation is suggested, this government does not include the public to be part of the process. The public who have elected us here to see their work done. We will have a lot of answers, I'm sure, to questions that will be asked of us. And, you know, the answers that some Nova Scotians are going to be hearing are not answers that they're probably going to be impressed with. Not impressed with at all. This week, looking back on this week, it's been kind of mind-boggling in a way. I mean, you know, dealing with electoral reform and not really seeing that happen, and then dealing with all of the embarrassing issues that came before this House. And meanwhile, here we are on the official opposition, trying to get the interests of Nova Scotians represented at the same time of all of this other kind of mind-boggling experiences here in the House. You know, talking about electoral reform, that really didn't happen. We're discussing the issues of members and, you know, the handling of government and conduct. And so when I go home, I'm not sure whether or not, you know, certainly I can say for myself that I have worked on behalf of my constituents while I've been here, but did we really work on behalf of all of Nova Scotians as a minority government? I don't think that I can quite indicate to my constituents that on behalf of all Nova Scotians that this minority government actually did a lot of work on their behalf this week. Again, this was a missed opportunity, but I do believe that there will be a chance in Nova Scotia for true electoral reform happen in this province. There will be a time when there will be an end to corporate donations, and there will be a time when there will be an end to union donations, and there will be a time when either the Liberal trust funds will kind of run out, or the Liberal trust funds will no longer be able to be used for electioneering purposes. I really hope that there have been some lessons in this process learned by all sides. I would think that, you know, the Liberals may, after their leadership race, perhaps think back and decide that perhaps they should have stood on their feet and address the concerns around this particular bill. And I'm also hoping that some members of the government side may go home and think, well, you know what, I had an opportunity and I could have spoken, I could have said why I'm supporting, why I will continue to support union donations, and why I continue to support union donations, and why I support the use of the Liberal Trust funds. You know, perhaps those members may have to answer those questions to their constituents, but, you know, they may decide to kind of give their opinion out there anyway prior to them being asked. So, you know, hopefully there will be some lessons. I guess there's not a lot, Mr. Speaker, more than I can say. I mean, certainly in the fall session, I talked a lot about the Liberal Trust funds and the scandals around that and the responsibility of government to move forward with good reform. I chose my time here today not to speak on those particular issues again because we have heard them. All of my colleagues have articulated very well the complete ins and outs of this particular legislation. I chose to stand here and talk about the missed opportunities that I see and the lack of public consultation and the real work that I don't see being done in this House this week because we have had a government and a Liberal caucus who really chose not to take the opportunity to debate and really discuss this issue. The fact that a committee was suggested back in the fall and the government has decided not to move forward on that. And Mr. Speaker, I think I have used up my time, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too am going to stand and have a few brief words on this issue of Bill 117. And I have to keep those brief words and comments within, I guess, the allowed time of approximately an hour. So hopefully I can do that, Mr. Speaker, because with this bill, of course, we have something against us, and that is time. Ultimately, this bill will pass through the process here in the House, Mr. Speaker, with the support of the Liberal Party and the government. We all know that. We knew that in the fall. But as an elected official, as a member of the official opposition here in this province, we take our job very seriously. And I think with every piece of legislation, we really try to improve that to hopefully come out with something better than what we started with. And we all agree, and we agree even though we've been up here on our feet, including the last fall session, and now I think close to maybe nearly 40, 50, maybe even 60 hours we have spoken about this legislation, Mr. Speaker, and we truly wanted to see if we could get positive changes to it. And I have to admit there was some amendments that we put forward to law amendments that passed, that the government accepted, which we appreciated, but ultimately the whole bill as a whole is still not what we would want, and we believe what the public would want. The public really wants us to look at changes and reform to party financing, to election financing, Mr. Speaker. I know it's not at the top of their interest level, but when you engage Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, like I have, on many issues, they let you know what they're thinking. And when you engage them and talk about this issue, like I have over the last couple months, Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned it to when people have approached me in the community on what we've done in the last session, and of course, the end of the session definitely was something that I went through for the first time on pulling the hoist on Bill 117 to try to allow for more of that exchange of ideas and try to educate the public on this bill and what the implications are. We were trying in the fall, Mr. Speaker, to get that 6-month reprieve to go out and do the consultation that I think we really need to do on this bill, Mr. Speaker. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, and I've actually had some of the government members say that we're following the procedures of the House around consultation. And it's that consultation that I think that we have lacked in, that we didn't give enough time to go out into the communities and ask them what they think about this piece of legislation. I recall, Mr. Speaker, it was back in the fall, well, in the winter, I guess, I think it was November, when early in the morning, on one morning, I don't know the exact date, there was a news release from the Minister of Justice calling for law amendments later that day to deal with Bill 117. And our caucus was surprised. We had no notice that that was going to be called. It was supposed to take place, I think, around 2, maybe 3 in the afternoon. And to my amazement, and I know many of our colleagues' amazements, that this actually happened. Well, come to find out that Law Amendments Committee did meet that day, Mr. Speaker, and I believe it was because our members couldn't attend. We have some of our members on that committee away. The Liberal members of that committee couldn't attend, and I believe it was on the eve of the Federal Leadership Convention in Montreal that they couldn't attend, so the meeting was canceled. But then it gave us that notice, the indication that government was trying to push this through the process. They were trying to get this piece of legislation through and keep us off keel, Mr. Speaker, on what we were hoping to do with this piece of legislation, and that was the consultation part, Mr. Speaker. We said in November, in the fall session, that we wanted to consult, and we stood here in our place. I actually was the last member, Mr. Speaker, to speak that day when I was told, listen, we've come to an understanding with the government. Our House Leader came to us and said, they're giving us the opportunity to delay this later on in the new year so that we could do that consultation. And we said, well, that's great. Then we succeeded in what we were doing back in the fall. And as the member from Halifax, Shabakto stated earlier, the cover of the Daily News, I think that day or the next day, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, was blah, 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 NDP submission, the Conservatives into agreeing to come to an understanding. And there was pictures of our members, 12 of our members had pictures and quotes on that cover, Mr. Speaker. And that is the process where we were going through to hopefully get that opportunity to talk to individuals, talk to Nova Scotians, talk to taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And I think those are the most important ones right now, are the taxpayers of this province, because they are ultimately, when this bill passes, are going to be responsible for funding political parties. Now, I don't know if the Conservatives from Yarmouth or the Liberals from Glace Bay understand that now they're going to be supporting the NDP through their taxes, Mr. Speaker. It's going to be interesting to see when they actually understand, when the public realize what passes this bill, when this bill passes, the implications and ultimately the funding of the political parties here in this province. Yes, of course, those who support our party now are going to be supporting the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, but I don't think people truly understand that and the implications of this bill and this this piece of legislation. That's why, as an opposition member, and as my colleague and my leader of our caucus have stood here hour after hour to bring up those points on this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. Because as I said, all taxpayers ultimately are going to be affected by this piece of legislation. Now, we've stated earlier, and I'll state it again, that I believe this piece of legislation was drafted to try to stem our party from some of the financing we get in election time, Mr. Speaker, and was really crafted around two parties. As the member from Queens stated earlier, as the party, the official opposition here in the province of Nova Scotia, we were not consulted on this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I think that was a misfortune, I think, for taxpayers. It was an oversight, hopefully, for the government, which I know it wasn't. They purposely kept us out of the loop on this one, Mr. Speaker, because it does affect us. But we're going to gain from this piece of legislation if it passes, Mr. Speaker. Between elections, we're going to continue to receive funding for the amount of votes that we receive, and I have to remind the government that for the last decade or more, the number of votes for our caucus, for our party, has increased, Mr. Speaker. We have 20 members of the legislature right now. I know that the MLA that I took over from, Mr. Holm, back in 1984, would have never thought, back then when there was only 2 and then 3 members of our caucus, that today we would have 20 members, and that the support for our party has grown every year since, and it continues to grow. And ultimately, our funds are going to go up because of that support in this province. And I think it's because of issues like this, or bills and the process of this House, that we continue as opposition members to stand and point out the good and the bad things about pieces of legislation, especially about Bill 17, that the public realize that they can put their confidence in us and their support behind us. And as I said, that continues to grow every day, Mr. Speaker, and it'll continue to grow, I think, and I believe, especially in recent days and months with some of the events that have casted some doubt on if this government should continue to rule and govern in this province. There's a lot of doubt right now, Mr. Speaker, even prior to the conduct that we've seen from one of the cabinet ministers in recent weeks. Mr. Speaker, there's been questions around policies and issues here in this province that the government have been ignoring for far too long, and people are starting to recognize that, Mr. Speaker, and are starting to say, has it been too long? Have they worn out their welcome, the Conservative Party? They've been in governing this province since '99, and I think that a lot of people, and I've talked to voters in this province, some of them are Conservative voters, some of them are Liberal voters, and of course our party supporters, and they're questioning that now, Mr. Speaker. Has this government run out of good options? And I think we've all seen many of the good ideas that our party has brought forward, our caucus has brought forward, that the government has adopted, and we're more than happy to lend them to them, to allow them to use our ideas, Mr. Speaker, and changes that we want to see in public policy. Changes like what we would hope we would have seen in Bill 117, Mr. Speaker. There was amendments that we brought forward as a caucus that we felt were important, that reflected what voters, what taxpayers would want to see, and I'll go through some of those later, the ones that didn't pass. I think it's important that we recognize that taxpayers wanted to see some of these changes, these amendments, and we brought them forward. And when one amendment wouldn't pass, Mr. Speaker, we didn't just give up, put our hands up and say, okay, we tried our best. We thought, well, as an opposition, as a party that has come to the table, has come to this chamber many times and been accountable and compromised with the government to try to work out a deal, work out a situation that might not be the best for all of us, but it's a good outcome that might be the best for the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And that's what we done. We came here with those amendments, with changes to this legislation that we all agree needs to take place in this province. And what happened, Mr. Speaker? The small amendments that government felt didn't really change the intent of the bill were passed and agreed on in law amendments, but the major ones, which I think would really reflect that intention or that the wishes of those who are going to be ultimately paying the price for this piece of legislation, things like eliminating the need or the requirement or the will of political parties to seek corporate and union donations, Mr. Speaker. That was a big step for us. It was a big step for our leader to stand up and say, no, let's try to be fair to the public. If the public is going to start funding our parties, then let's try to make it a level playing field for all 3 parties so that when we go into the next election, we're all starting at the same spot, Mr. Speaker. And with this legislation the way it is now, that's not going to happen. We will still continue to see corporate donations, which this piece of legislation really tailored around. If you looked at the books of the donations received from the Conservative Party over the last whatever years, you could look back 20 elections, that a high percentage of their income comes from the corporate donations in the range of $1,000 to $5,000, Mr. Speaker. They receive a lot of money between those numbers, Mr. Speaker. And also, we see that the use of the trust fund that the Liberal Party has, that we all know the history of it, we all know the implications of the wrongdoing that had happened years ago, and people were convicted on it, Mr. Speaker. We all know the history. I won't go into it in details. I know that maybe I should, but I won't. We all know that there was a questionable way of receiving that trust fund, Mr. Speaker, and we know the outcome that, the money that they could actually trace back to illegal dealings was given back to the province, Mr. Speaker. But they also stated during the audit that they done at the time that, they couldn't tell where a majority of the money came from. So we can't tell them to give it back. Mr. Speaker, the use of those funds will always shed a shadow of doubt on, I believe, your party, Mr. Speaker, and the Liberal Party on where it actually came from. You can't tell us where it came from because it seems to be no trace, Mr. Speaker. So the rightful thing, I think, to do is to get rid of that. Give it back to the taxpayers. Imagine what Liberals and potential Liberal voters would think if the Liberals would ultimately someday say, okay, let's get rid of this trust fund. Maybe they'll have more than 9 seats that they have now, Mr. Speaker. Who knows? Maybe they would. Maybe I shouldn't be suggesting that because I hope that they continue to go on the trend that they've been going on in the last several elections, Mr. Speaker. But maybe if they did the right thing, that their fortunes would change. But I won't go there, Mr. Speaker. They choose to continue on the path they're on, and I think that leaves questions in the minds of voters around elections. And this will come up in the next election. It hasn't come up too much, I believe, in the 2 previous elections that I've been involved in. But with this piece of legislation coming back and coming through this chamber, Mr. Speaker, it brings all that back into play. People will have those questions. It got tucked away for a few years, maybe 10, 15 years, Mr. Speaker, but it'll be back. There'll be questions in the next election. I guarantee it that this issue will come up and the issues of corporate and union donations in the next election. It will, because of this piece of legislation. And I think if we wanted to truly try to clean up the image and the cynicism that voters have around political parties, no matter what party they support, then we need to try to level that playing field and show a transparency in how we work as a party, as a political party, but also as MLAs, Mr. Speaker. And I think that amendment that we brought forward was something that we should have looked at. We should have, the government and the Liberal Party should have endorsed and should have thought that was the right approach for this legislation to make it a better piece of legislation when it finally gets to the vote at the end of this 3rd reading process, Mr. Speaker. But when that amendment didn't come forth, Mr. Speaker, the elimination of union and corporate donations, the elimination of the Liberal Trust Fund, we thought, well, what can we do? Let's try to make this, let's rethink our idea. Maybe we can come to an understanding to try to make this bill even better, as I said several times. So we suggested another amendment, that cap that we have in this piece of legislation at $5,000 for a union or a corporate donation. How about we look at that and let's try to wean off that. Let's try to reduce that over the next several years so that in a few years' time, we won't have to have or won't have the ability to seek those donations, Mr. Speaker. So that was an amendment we brought forward to try to reduce it by, I think it was 2010. I'm not too sure exactly the time, but this election we would set it at $5,000. The next year or so would be $4,000, $3,000, so on, so that ultimately we would wean down and ultimately result in no donations from corporate or unions in this province, Mr. Speaker. It was a compromise. It was an understanding that I thought our colleagues said, well, it's not what we want. We want to ban them all. It's not what we want. But this job isn't about what we want. It's not what about the NDP caucus wants. It's about what the voters want. It's what Nova Scotians want. And I believe they want something like that, Mr. Speaker. And I would have hoped that the government would have looked at that amendment and said, well, we're in a minority situation here. We have to work with the other parties, even though in the last 6 months I haven't seen too much of that, Mr. Speaker, other than the so-called coalition that the Liberals and the Conservatives have right now to get through this session especially. And I'll talk a little bit about why we're here in this chamber, in this historic chamber, for one reason, to pass one bill, Mr. Speaker. But I think we need to recognize that, as a minority government, the ideas that come forward should be really scrutinized, looked, evaluated, and we should be able to come to an understanding. That's what the voters of this province put us here for. They didn't put us here, they didn't put the government here to rule on every policy that comes through this House, Mr. Speaker. They didn't give them that right. With the 23 seats that they have, they didn't give them that right to rule on everything that comes through this chamber, Mr. Speaker. They reserved judgment on government in the last election. They actually took away some seats from them, Mr. Speaker. They reserved judgment on what is going on, what the dealings of government have been over the last 3.5 years since the last election, before the election in the summer. They reserved judgment on that. And the point was made, I think, by the voters that we need to work as a group here on pieces of legislation, especially, I think, reform like this, where it deals with party financing. That's not just dealing with one party. This is dealing with all three parties that are sitting here in this chamber, Mr. Speaker. So I think the decision to continue on here in the province as a minority government, it's incumbent upon us as MLAs to make sure that we try to negotiate, we try to reason with each other to get the best possible outcome to legislation and public policy. And there's no difference if we're talking about the budget or if we're talking about Bill 117, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't matter. You shouldn't have to negotiate for a few and just stand firm on other ones. We need to negotiate on everything. We need to make sure that the public interest is taken into account with the minority government here in this province. And I got to say, Mr. Speaker, I was elected here in 2003, and the former Premier, John Hamm, had worked with our caucus on a lot of issues, Mr. Speaker, a lot. He sought input from our caucus because he knew, he respected that voters in 2003 had made a decision, had reserved judgment on the government. He recognized that, something that I think the new Premier has forgotten, and I hope that maybe the former Premier, Dr. Hamm, will have coffee with the current Premier and make him realize that ultimately he's responsible to the people of this province, and he has to abide by what they want, or he won't be sitting in that chair much longer, Mr. Speaker. So maybe Dr. Hamm will give that call to the Premier and give him a wake-up call to say, listen, you have to start looking at the best interest of the public, not the best interest of government, and not the best interest of the Conservative Party. You have to look at the best interest of the public when legislation comes through this chamber, like this bill, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, this is ultimately going to affect the taxpayers of this province, the people that pay my salary, the people that pay the salaries of the government members and the cabinet members. And I don't think we went through the process allowing those taxpayers to have the best chance to have input. As I said, this isn't at the highest priority list or on the highest priority list for taxpayers, but if you can engage them, which I think is all the responsibility of members here, to talk about what do you think about this piece of legislation, not just sit back and say we called law amendments one day, we had a couple presenters, there's no interest out there. You can't judge it like that, especially when law amendments was called leading up to the holiday season, Mr. Speaker, leading up to the busiest time of the year for all of us. We all know that. So you can't judge the appetite for change or the lack of appetite for change in something like party financing on that indication. As I said earlier, the government tried to rush this through by calling law amendments one morning. I remember the news release the Minister of Justice sent out calling for law amendments later that day, and there wasn't enough members of that committee around to have that meeting. We knew then that this was going to be rushed. through this House. And what happened after that, Mr. Speaker? They did hold law amendments. A few members of the public, ones that we could try to get to make presentations. We tried to make it known to the public during the holiday season, during that lead up to the holiday season, to get in here. We did have some presenters at that, Mr. Speaker, and they had concerns with this. There was 8 of them, I believe, Mr. Speaker. And so what happened after that, Mr. Speaker? We know. It's why we're standing here today, this week. The government deemed fit to think that this was a piece of legislation we had to get through. So they called a winter session, which hasn't happened since I've been here for nearly 4 years. I don't think, from reading in the public or members here, have never had a winter setting. Maybe yourself, Mr. Speaker, I know you've been here, I believe, over 15 years. Not quite 15 years, but you've been here a while. So it's rare. It's rare. Everybody should agree to that. It's rare to come back to this House at this time on January 4th to talk about legislation. But it wasn't to talk about legislation, to talk about bills, to talk about public policy. It was to talk about Bill 117. And it was a surprise for most of the members of my caucus. Because, as I said earlier, in the fall session, we tried to bring forward a hoist to allow some time to do that consultation I talked about several times now. And one of the agreements, I thought, and maybe, yes, we were at fault, we never got anything in writing from the government about us to sit down. For me, actually, Mr. Speaker, because I was actually the last speaker on that, when all my colleagues were speaking for an hour on the hoist, and the reason why we wanted that, I was the last speaker, and I was given a note to say, listen, close debate on that. We're going to allow some time so that we can do that. And we said, great. So it was kind of a surprise for us to see all of a sudden we're back January 4th to deal with this piece of legislation, and not further in the winter, or actually, why not, as many of us said, brought back in the spring during the budget vote. And we all know, the rumors are going around that it's not going to be that long until we're back here debating the estimates and debating the budget, Mr. Speaker. So I don't understand. I really don't understand the need to really rush us through this step and to bring us back to deal with this one bill.
What about the select committee?
I have that down here. So as I was saying, I don't understand why there was such a rush. Why there was such a rush? Because, as I said, a couple more months, I think maybe I'll make a prediction here, Mr. Speaker, that the week after March break, we'll probably be called back to this House to deal with the budget. We all know that the Liberal Party has a pending leadership race, and that, I think, is affecting why we're seeing us come back at that time. I know, I can only guess, I guess, because I'm not privy to whatever agreement or coalition that the Liberals and Conservatives have, but I would suggest that there's some agreement to get the budget here, to get it approved and get it out so that the Liberals can concentrate on their leadership race. And as I said, that brings me back to another amendment. I know I mentioned around to end the corporate and union donations, but around the leadership race of an individual as an MLA for a political party, Mr. Speaker. That was another amendment we brought forward, and we talked about it this week. And it was to ensure that transparency, that accountability for individuals who take it upon themselves to take that jump. And it's a big jump, Mr. Speaker. I know that. I know that those individuals who decide to run for the leader of an official party here in the province, it's a big jump. One I'm sure the Premier is questioning right now. I know it's been early in his jump to do that. But it's a big jump, and it's a big requirement, and I think it's necessary to ensure that when individuals, because it could be an individual, you don't have to be a member of this House to run as a leader, but as individuals, as members of the legislature who deem it appropriate or it's time for them to make that jump to run for leader for their party, that there's accountability there's transparency. And in the amendment we brought forward, Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, it outlined the need, I think, that taxpayers would want to see, that voters would want to see, to ensure that those individuals who seek donations for a leadership race disclose who they are, Mr. Speaker. Be very open with voters, and ultimately be very open with members of their own party. Because we all know that whoever votes for a leader of a party belongs to that party. So it's ultimately being more transparent, more accountable to the people who we represent, not only our constituents, but the party we choose to park our support behind, Mr. Speaker. And I think this was a reasonable approach to addressing that concern, and the need for accountability was to ensure that those individuals who took that jump, who decided to run as leader for a political party, that they're accountable and it's transparent, and that any donations that they receive are disclosed within a 30-day timeline, Mr. Speaker, so that not only the people in their own party, but the people of this province recognize who are supporting them. And it gives that extra, I think, good feeling that, the old-time politics aren't still happening here in the province of Nova Scotia. That we're willing, if someone's willing to donate to me, I'm willing to stand up and say, these are the people that donated to me, Mr. Speaker, on a timely manner. Right now, there's no law right now that states anybody who runs for a leader of a party has to divulge that information, which I don't understand why we even accept that. Why is it any different if you're running to be a leader of a party than it is if you're running to be an MLA? As an MLA, I know for myself, I've done it twice now, that we have to be very cautious. There's very strict guidelines on who we can take donations from, and especially around the reporting of those donations. There's very strict guidelines. So if I'm held to that high level of accountability, I would expect the same, if not higher, level of accountability to be thrust upon the leader of my party, the leader of the Conservative Party, the leader of the Liberal Party, or any other party that might form in the future in this province, Mr. Speaker. I think they should be held at even a higher accountability level to their own supporters in their party and to the taxpayers of this province, especially when this bill passes, because ultimately the taxpayers, even if they're not involved in the Conservative Party or our party or the Liberals, will be funding our parties. So I think we need to ensure that leaders in their leadership race has those guidelines, those strict guidelines in there. And that's why I don't understand why we're holding our leaders at a lower standard when it comes to disclosure of donors to their political aspirations to become a leader of an official party here in the province of Nova Scotia. We don't have to look far, Mr. Speaker, to see changes that have already happened here in the country. I know other provinces, we've mentioned it before, have deemed it fit to make sure that party financing and reform to Election Act is transparent, and that there's guidelines to ensure accountability there for taxpayers. Quebec, we've heard that I think this week several times. Years ago, actually, Mr. Speaker, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was even brought forward by the Bloc Québécois, who were in power at the time in Quebec, and all parties supported it. Now the Liberal Party, follows those rules in Quebec. Jean Charest, I'm sure now, when he ran and won the leadership for that party and the provincial party, had to divulge his information, who donated to him, how much. It seems like a natural step to take those regulations and ensure that they're in whatever act pertains to donors and financing in the province here in Nova Scotia or wherever, across the country, Mr. Speaker. There's other provinces, I believe Manitoba, I think, have the same strong accountability clauses and guidelines in their Election Act. And also, Mr. Speaker, our federal cousins, our members of Parliament, recently, Mr. Speaker, changed reform to the way elections are funded and the requirement of disclosure around donations. They went through this, something like what we're going through here on Bill 117. And what's different there is there was wide consultation. I heard about it on a daily-ish timeline, Mr. Speaker, from Ottawa in the papers around the need for change. There was a need for change, there was a need for accountability, and we all know really what really gave that issue the kick in the butt it needed to get out there, and it was around, of course, the Gomery inquiry and all that that transpired around that, Mr. Speaker. Voters in this country were upset that this was allowed to happen, and they were tired of it happening. It's happened for years and years, not only provincially but federally, where there seems to be a secrecy around political financing, donors, who does, who doesn't, who's getting kickbacks, as we've seen in the federal politics a couple of years ago, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's what brewed the cynicism that we have in the political world, in the political, or in the financing of political parties here in the country. So they adopted change in Ottawa, Mr. Speaker. They first of all kicked out a government, replaced it, which often happens, which I've often said here in the province of Nova Scotia and across the country, that voters rarely vote for a party to put them in power, Mr. Speaker. They rarely vote for a party to govern. They usually get rid of one. They vote to get rid of one. And we see it time and time again in history, Mr. Speaker. We've seen it in this province, and we've seen it in Ottawa, that voters get tired of the party that is there and they vote them out. And I've always expressed, especially to my voters, the constituent in my areas, that how about it's time we vote a government in. Put somebody in there to give them a chance. And that's the message I know many of my colleagues have gone around this province with, and it's actually taking root, and people are actually agreeing with that, Mr. Speaker. And I think time will tell if that will be the case here in the province. But as I said, in Ottawa, we've seen those changes. After the Gomery events and all that stuff that was exposed, voters said enough was enough. And they made changes. They made changes, and they adopted it, and all parties supported it, Mr. Speaker. All parties had input on what they wanted to see. And there, the minority government, like we have here, especially over the last several years, is very unstable. I got to say, it's more unstable than Nova Scotia's minority government has been in the last 3.5, almost 4 years, Mr. Speaker. But yet on this issue, around political financing and reform and disclosure and transparency and accountability, they were able to sit down and say, yes, we all understand, we all recognize voters want that. It might not be the highest thing on their agenda. We all know health care is. Every poll that we had, I'm sure that the government has, or the Liberals had, provincially, federally, say health care, housing, social needs are important. But when you were asked, or you engaged the public on changes, especially to finance, they said, no, we agree, we need changes there. It might not be the first thing they say, but as I said, if you engage them, they will talk about this issue, and they will say they want changes. So I don't understand how our members of Parliament from all parties, who have 300 and some members, I don't even know what the number is now, Mr. Speaker, Minister of Health, he's trying to help me, but there's many, Mr. Speaker, many parts of this country that are small, rural islands and inlets, and the north, and I mean the east, the west, they were all able to come together and make positive changes to a piece of legislation that was going through the House of Commons. I think it's the Federal Accountability Act, I believe is what their piece of legislation is called. So that's why I don't understand, if we see that cooperation, that ability for our federal MPs, for the three parties that we have here, and in Ottawa we have the Bloc, which is another party that has self-interest, Mr. Speaker. They even agreed with this. It might have been because in their own province they have a similar piece of legislation, so they thought, what's the big harm if we reflect what we do in our own province provincially? Why can't we do it federally? So here we have the federal government, all the parties on the federal scene agree change the way politics has been funded and the changes to bring more accountability to election and the financing of parties and the political parties here in this country, Mr. Speaker. That's why I don't understand why we can't have the same thing here in Nova Scotia. Why are we settling for less? Why are we holding ourselves at a lower level of accountability? As I said with one of the amendments around financing or disclosure of donors for leaders of political parties, and they're even lower on a lower level of accountability than the MLAs here are going to be required to have to maintain, Mr. Speaker. I don't understand that. And I don't believe anybody over there on the government side or anybody in the Liberal side who have continued to say that they're going to support this could change my mind on this, could give me an argument to say why we're settling for less than what the people of this country said we wanted to see in Ottawa, but yet we don't hear here today. And I'd be prepared to sit down right now and allow maybe the Minister of Justice, maybe the Minister of Health, maybe the Minister of Transportation, Minister of Energy to stand up and give me a reason why we're putting our accountability level lower than what we expect our MPs have. The member of the Minister of Community Services, I would love for her to stand up and tell me why our MPs are held at a higher level of accountability than our own members here, Mr. Speaker. What about the members of the Liberal Party? I'd sit down and let them stand up and try to explain to me why we need to put this piece of legislation through without making it as strong as possible, or at least the same as what we have in Ottawa and what we hold our members of Parliament at. I just don't understand. I don't think, and I don't see any people gesturing to me that they want to stand up and give that to me, Mr. Speaker. So ultimately, we see that's the difference between the three parties here in this province. We see a coalition between the Liberals and the Conservatives to support this piece of legislation that holds Nova Scotians, politicians, political parties at a lower level of accountability than we do in Ottawa. And we've stood here. That's why we're on our 50-some hour of debate on this bill, is to make sure that the public knows this and that the people of this province and the taxpayers who are going to be funding the parties know this, and that the members of the government and the members of the Liberal Party will have to. Hopefully somebody will hear this and hopefully they'll question them on it, and maybe they can try to answer that question for those voters that approach them. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we've been here for a while, and we feel it's important that we stand here and bring forward the changes, the amendments that didn't go through, and reflect on them and try to encourage voters, people that might be listening, people who might read these debates later on, to inquire and ask questions and try to get answers of why this piece of legislation didn't go through with stronger clauses, stronger guidelines for accountability in this province around the financing of political parties. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, we're here in a rare winter sitting of the legislature. Part of me saying I'm very glad I've been here for the last week. It's been an interesting week. I know that many of the government members probably are thinking they're not too glad that they decided to bring us back. Something about timing, I think, just doesn't help the cause of their government and the decline, I think, in the support they've had. And they can't deny that they've had a decline, especially after the last election, Mr. Speaker. So that's why I think it's important that they realize, and I said it earlier around the cooperation and the ability to talk with the other parties to try to get legislation through this House that is good for the public, good public policy. And I don't understand why they took the approach they did with this piece of legislation. I can understand maybe a little bit if we were talking about the budget and the Financial Measures Act, when we all know that if there is no support for it in this province now with the minority government, that it would trigger an election. We all know that. So I can understand maybe to a certain point them trying to get the support of one of our parties over here. I understand that. our party has supported the last several budgets because we understood that it was something that the public wanted, that the budget reflected a lot of the things that we have stood here and fought for, and there was that cooperation, that working with us on many issues, and many of the issues that, as I said, we brought forward, they addressed, so we supported that budget. I can understand that, because there's consequences if it's the budget, if it's the Financial Measures Act, Mr. Speaker. But with this piece of legislation, there's no consequences right now. There's no election that's going to happen when we stand up, maybe tonight or tomorrow or whenever the vote is, or a Monday for this bill. If we vote against it, which I can say now we don't support, there's not the consequences of an election being triggered. So that's why I don't understand why the steps weren't taken to ensure that a piece of legislation like this wouldn't have been put out to be consulted not only with the public, but with all three parties. It involves all three parties. It's really involving mostly just us here in this chamber, the three parties that are represented here. It's really going to benefit us when there's no elections. We're gonna rake in some, I don't even know what the figures are. I didn't even want to look at that right now. Over $100,000, I believe, a year is going to come to our party because of the number of votes we have. So we're all going to benefit here. No questions asked, Mr. Speaker. The problem is around elections that we had, and I pointed them out earlier. I won't go over them again unless I'm running or have a lot of time left, but I don't think I do. I won't go over them again right now. But with this piece of legislation, why wasn't that something that the government would recognize, saying, well, we all want it. We stated from the start of this piece of legislation, we want something like this to come forward so that we can give that assurance to voters, to public, to taxpayers, that we as MLAs, we as members of a political party want to make sure that we're accountable to the taxpayers and there's transparency, so that we can try to get over that cynicism, as I said so many times, and try to fix what the image out there is around political parties. And I remembered a conversation with someone I had earlier around how we talked about that cynicism and how people hold us on such low regards, as public officials, but actually, he said it's not true for him. And when I was having the conversation, I reflected on it, and it's true. I think in many of the ridings in our province, especially the 20 that we represent, maybe because they had that cynicism for so long that they recognized it was need for change. And we've grown as a caucus. We've grown in the last election, and I think that shift indicates that voters don't want to see the same old-time politics in this province. They want to make sure that the changes we make in legislation like Bill 117 is what they want to see, to try to clean up politics, if you want to say. I hate saying that, but clean up politics. And make sure that, when I send out a letter, maybe in the next campaign, requesting a donation, because we all have to do that, we all recognize the need to do that, that
Don't put it on MLA letter.
that voters know that I am going to be very open and accountable to divulging, disclosing who I send those letters out to. Maybe not who I send the letters out to, because I don't get donation from everybody I send a letter to. I wish I did. But those who do, that I disclose that. So that the old-time politics, I think, is out in the open when it comes to, do I owe anybody anything? And I feel, ultimately, that, by disclosing in a timely manner who I get donations from would help to alleviate that. If we all know, like I said earlier, in the leadership race, for those individuals who run for a leadership race, if they were able to divulge or disclose, or would be required to disclose who financed their campaign right at the start, we wouldn't find out 6 months later and say, oh, by the way, look at this. That's why maybe a government member who ran for leader gave a contract to somebody. That goes through somebody's mind every time it's reported, Mr. Speaker. Every time it's reported. We can go right now, and I know some people referred to them earlier about the donations that the current premier had, and you can go through that and find number of companies. You can find businesses that have received since that election money and donate or government contracts from government. But I truly believe, for one, if we adopted one of our amendments to get rid of it altogether, we wouldn't have to talk about it. But I believe if we had supported, or if government supported some of our other clauses, that we wouldn't have that perception that, whoa, maybe that's why they got that money. And I'm not going to name the companies. The papers can do that. There's papers now that do that on a regular basis, not only for government members, but for our members, Mr. Speaker. They do that. It's there. Eventually, it's going to get out. So I don't understand why, we don't just have it in the bill in the first place. Make it easy. It would be easier on the premier. It would be easier on cabinet minister, on government, if right after the potential or the election of a leader that, here you go, here's who donated to me, let it go, people recognize it, and then when the time comes to issue those contracts, I think people would understand, hopefully, if the government does their job properly, that the companies that receive contracts here in this province receive them because of their merits, because of their worth ethics, because of the job they do, and the jobs they've done in the past are good jobs, and we need to continue to support that, because we've got to support the industry here in the province, and everybody recognizes that. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I know I've talked a little bit on all the issues, but as I said at the start, time is definitely against us on this. We all know that this bill will pass. And as I explained on a lot of the examples I gave over the last while, why we made amendments and why we think there should be stronger guidelines in this legislation to give that accountability to the taxpayers who ultimately will be paying for this, Mr. Speaker. And my discouragement to have to come back to this House, because, and it's not because I'm back here, but to be back here and discuss one piece of legislation. Why didn't the government take this opportunity to bring forward other legislation, other pieces of legislation, other issues that people need to be, that the government needs to be addressing? We've mentioned them in question period. It gave us the opportunity to question some of the ministers around some of the issues that we hear from in between the sessions that we have, like healthcare, Mr. Speaker. I could stand here and list probably 100 different areas that I think government need to address, or could bring legislation forward that would improve the delivery of health care, improve the wait times in our province, if you're dealing with surgery, or if you're dealing with mental health, Mr. Speaker. Why isn't government bringing that forward? Why are they just bringing forward Bill 117? That's what I don't understand. That's why I'm discouraged to be here, Mr. Speaker. I love being here in this chamber. I love this part of my job as an MLA. It's an honor to be here and to be able to debate and talk about issues. I enjoy it, but I'm discouraged. I'm here to talk about Bill 117, and only Bill 117. I know that bills and legislation that goes through there's never full consent and agreement and approval from government or from the members. But I would hope that government would have seen fit to hold this rare winter sitting. It was an opportunity for them to bring forward some of their agendas, some of the issues, some of the changes that we need to see in the coming months. Minister of Health earlier today said, and very soon we're going to hear some things around long-term care. Well, why didn't he take the opportunity today? Here he has the attention of the media to a certain extent. There's other issues they're dealing with, but they have the attention of the media. We have the attention of Ledge TV. We have the attention of other members of this chamber, when he could have made an announcement today maybe. Why wouldn't he have chose that opportunity? Why weren't we brought back to hear all the good things that the government's going to announce over the next little while? That's what I would hope we'd be here talking about, discussing. I know it's part of my job. I will stand here and discuss Bill 117, like I said, we have, and try to bring changes to it and amendments to it to improve it, because I think that's why I'm here. I respect the voters, and our position here in this House is to be the official opposition. I respect that. I said that earlier. And I think government needs to respect it also, that they're there to govern, not only on just one issue, not only on just one bill, like Bill 117, Mr. Speaker, on many issues. Many issues, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of issues out there that need to be addressed. There's a lot of legislation that we need to see go through this House. And we all know in a couple months maybe we'll be back here to talk about the budget and how involved we get with estimates, the requirements to get involved during estimates, and the approval process for that. And I often had said that it takes away, I think, from some of the other pieces of legislation that comes forward from our party, from the Liberals, and from the government, other government bills, because the budget is the ultimate focus of that session, because especially now in minority government, if that one piece of legislation or the two, well, one, the budget or the Financial Measures Act doesn't pass, then that triggers the election. But it takes away, I think, the focus and the attention that's needed on those other pieces of legislation that's introduced at that time. So why didn't the government say, well, when the budget comes in, when we call the House back, we're going to deal with the budget, we're going to deal with estimates and the Financial Measures Act, and now with this rare sitting of the winter sitting of the legislature, we could see some of those pieces of legislation out. We could be debating here for the next couple of weeks. Get rid of that. Get the focus on what government wants to do with that, then deal in the spring around the budget. That I don't understand, and that's why I say I'm a bit discouraged to be here now during this session, Mr. Speaker. Bill 117. That's why I'm discouraged to be here, just to talk about Bill 117. So as with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I know there's other members of our caucus that want to talk on this. They're anxious to talk about this. I know it's going to be the last time I can stand and speak on an issue till the spring, but we'll be back. Maybe we can find out some rules there that we can continue this on for another little while, but I don't know. We're running out of those, I think. So I know the member is going to, other members of my caucus want to speak. But as I said, it's important that we recognize we have a minority government here in this province, and I think with this piece of legislation, the government forgot that the cooperation that we've seen over the last 3.5 years with minority government hasn't taken place with this piece of legislation. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, with those few words that I had.
The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Speaker. Well, I can tell by the reaction of members opposite that they have been waiting with bated breath for my comments, and I will try not to let them down, Mr. Speaker. My colleague from Halifax-Chebucto started for us earlier today, and he made reference to the front of the newspaper, Daily News, I believe, was blah, 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 NDP bores government into submission, or some such thing. And he mentioned with regret the fact that his picture wasn't one of the 12 that was of us that had actually spoken in the second reading. And and it kind of raised the point of wasn't really sure why it was that he hadn't been on the list, but I just kind of wanted to let him know it must have been I before E, and that was the reason I made it ahead of him. We've heard a lot from obviously from my colleagues on this bill, and I guess we always come back, or I guess I have to come back to the question of why this piece of legislation and why now. And I know the government members, as my colleague who just spoke alluded to, that the government members are probably saying why now, especially in light of all the circumstance around this week. But the Premier's answers in question period always seemed to indicate, or he tries to indicate, of the other issues that he wants to deal with, the issues that are important to Nova Scotians, and that's what he would like to see the House talk about, and instead of recent events around his former Minister of Human Resources. But you know, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier actually was concerned about other issues, why are we dealing with only one piece of legislation? There hasn't been another bill called for second reading in this week. There's been no indication that the government is moving on any other agenda or any other issues other than this piece of legislation, which is Bill 117, the Members and Public Employees Disclosure Act. So even though the Premier does go out of his way in question period to try to convince the opposition that he is more concerned about other issues that are more relevant to Nova Scotians, his government side of the House has flatly refused to bring forward any legislation on any other issues or even have much discussion of any other issues, which I think there are issues that are important in Nova Scotia, certainly more so than this piece of legislation. You know, well, I guess I don't want to use unparliamentary language, Mr. Speaker. So, and I try to make an effort in the House not to do that. But let me just say that this is a piece of legislation that I would deem to be not particularly friendly to the New Democratic Party. Now, I think it's being sold as kind of leveling the playing field when it comes to electoral finance reform, and the fact that there is a $5,000 cap on union and corporate donations. Well, on the face of it, that seems to be pretty sensible. You know, a $5,000 cap for both these groups, but in essence, Mr. Speaker, and if we labor under the assumption that New Democrats get more money from unions than the other parties do, which some people do labor under, the idea would be that if the Conservatives or Liberals get more money from corporations, a $5,000 cap, if you had 10 companies whose employees were members under a particular union, each one of those 10 companies could make a $5,000 donation, but the union would only make one $5,000 donation, which would be a comparison of $50,000 compared to $5,000. So in essence, really, and assuming that we were the beneficiary of the union donation, then we could assume that the New Democrats in the next election would have a much tougher time getting funding than the other parties, and certainly this one of the I guess hardest to swallow aspects of this piece of legislation is the legitimizing of Liberal trust funds and allowing the Liberal Party to keep that money. And I think my colleague from Halifax, Chebucto, probably spoke to this well enough. But when you find that through this whole process, the government did not go through the Electoral Reform Commission or the Electoral Commission. This piece of legislation wasn't vetted through that commission, and you have to say, if they weren't willing to do that, why not? If we're deeming to be transparent and open and all the things that government tries to insist that it is, then why not let that body, which is the usual body certainly that looks at legislation around elections, that has some say, makes some adjustment, or gives its stamp of approval, that this was a step that the government chose. I'm assuming thinking they know best, and perhaps didn't want to wear any comments from the commission that would indicate that they had a problem with this piece of legislation. Now, I'm not sure what language actually is in the bill of 117, Mr. Speaker, around the $1.50 that parties collect as a result of number of votes you get or whatever. But my colleague from Halifax Shabukto actually cited an argument under the charter, right to vote, where since the old line parties, and I'm not sure at what point, I guess we could think of the New Democrats now as one of the old line parties, but that because the parties that get the more votes get the more money, this could be seen as a barrier to entry. In other words, it would be difficult for a new party to get started because the other parties would get this extra foothold by getting more money. And not because I can speak in a professional way to a charter argument. I guess what I have the difficulty with, Mr. Speaker, is that we are an assembly of lawmakers. We are the body in this province that gives the stamp of approval, I guess we could say. Certainly if a majority of the members in the House vote for a piece of legislation, it's going to pass through the House. So the problem I have is that the government would bring in a bill that would actually have flags attached to it that would raise an issue of a charter challenge. And if there is any place where we would expect that a piece of legislation would meet all the standards, all the appropriate standards to prevent a challenge, any challenge to a piece of legislation.
Allow an introduction.
Certainly.
Thank you to all members from Hants East. The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion and Protection on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand in my place to make an introduction to members of the House. Today in the East Gallery, we have Ken Faulkner, a longtime Sackville resident, and normally can be seen in the bleachers at the Sackville Blazers hockey games, cheering on the Blazers. If Mr. Faulkner would rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They're tough to beat. So, Mr. Speaker, when I talked about other issues that the Premier had alluded to in his answers and question period, and there are lots of them. I mean, we've had on Tuesday and today, we've had two different groups who've been to the House trying to draw attention to issues that they have, and in particular on Tuesday was the hog producers. And the hog producers are in a terrible way right now. I talked with one producer who ships 300 hogs a week. He's losing $40 a hog. So $12,000 a week is what he's losing. So now this, I would think, would be an issue the Premier would want to deal with rather than be dealing with Bill 117. And to what point the government is willing to let that continue. The issue of poverty in Nova Scotia, the issue of poverty in Canada, a country that has as much wealth that it does, and yet we are willing to let people who produce our food to enter the poverty rolls. In other words, we're willing to force them into poverty because they cannot get enough out of the value chain to keep their operations sustainable. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you were outside the other day when I was speaking, but I had bought a roast from Sobeys, about 5 pounds. It cost me $19.04, and a hog producer gets, and actually that roast sold for $8.35 a kilogram or some such thing, and a hog producer gets $1.25 a kilogram. So a hog producer would get about $2.90 for that roast, and Sobeys would get $19.04. Now, that wasn't always the way the world was. The value out of the value chain, producers always got a greater percentage. In recent years, it's been whittled down. The retail sector gets about 58% of the consumer dollar. The rest is shared between the processor and the farmer. So if we were to talk about issues other than Bill 117, like the Premier indicates in question period that he wants to, then this would be something that I would think the House would be interested in doing. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the government, I think, has been credited over some time, particularly in the forest sector, for the Sustainability Fund. And what the Sustainability Fund is a fund that's collected per cubic meter of wood or cord of wood that goes, a levy, that goes into a fund, and then it's spent for silviculture programs, etc. And I'm not sure why the province couldn't establish a sustainability fund for agriculture and allow the processors and retailers to pay into that fund